Hi everybody, it's a gorgeous May day, not too hot, still a little bit of bluster in the air, and I'm going to get onto my bike and head around the city in search of the history of the couple Elise and Otto Hampel, so please join me. Otto Hampel was born in 1897 in eastern Germany, and Elise Lemme was born in 1903 in a small town west of Berlin. Both came from working class backgrounds. They met in Berlin, became a couple, and moved in together in the neighborhood of Wedding in 1934, marrying on January 23, 1937. They would not have children. Otto had served in the infantry during World War I, after which he joined the ex-servicemen's association called the Steel Helmets and the German Labour Front, the Nazi organization which replaced the independent trades unions in Germany after 1933. Otto worked in the Siemens cable factory in the Berlin borough of Gartenfeld. Elise had a secondary school education and had worked as a maid before marrying Otto. She was one of 10 children, 5 of whom had died in infancy, and she was especially close to her younger brother Kurt and to her many nieces. She joined the women's division of the Nazi Party, but would leave it in 1940 when she learned that her brother Kurt had died fighting in France during the Second World War. The death of Kurt Lemme, coupled with the growing dissatisfaction in Nazi rule, led Elise and Otto to envision a curious form of resistance during the war. Over the next 2 years, they began to anonymously leave postcards critical of Hitler and the German war effort in various apartment stairwells, train stations, and public squares. Otto would write and deposit the postcards, and Elise was his confidant and lookout. Most of the postcards were left near to their home in Wedding, but they also left cards in other neighborhoods such as Charlottenburg, Schöneberg, and Kreuzberg. The postcards contain such messages as Hitler's war is the workers' death, free press, why suffer war and death for the Hitler plutocracy, all reasonable Germans work to eliminate the Hitler war machine, wake up. It is known that they wrote 192 of these cards, which ended up in the offices of the Gestapo. The Gestapo carried out a rigorous investigation, but could not track down the culprits until they were discovered and denounced in September 1942. Otto and Elise Hampel were taken into the custody of the Gestapo in October 1942. They admitted freely to writing the postcards, and both claimed equal responsibility. They were remanded in custody in Moabite prison until their trial at the People's Court in January 1943, where both were declared guilty of preparation for high treason and sentenced to death. Elise and Otto were executed in Plutonsi prison in Berlin on the same night, April 8, 1943. It is quite possible that the story of Elise and Otto Hampel would have been remembered only by their friends and relatives, were it not for the fact that an author called Rudolf Ditzen, who wrote under the pseudonym Hans Fallada, was by chance given the Hampels' Gestapo file shortly after the war and became determined to tell their story. His novel Every Man Dies Alone, based upon the resistance efforts of the Hampels, was written in 24 days, just a few months before Fallada's death in 1947. So now we're travelling up Strasse. This is the main street of this part of Wedding, fairly near to where the Hampels lived. Very busy, working class neighbourhood today, very multicultural place. One of the more affordable parts of the city, but nevertheless gentrifying today too, like all of Berlin. On this street, Mullerstrasse, Otto left many of his cards, and actually quite a few buildings he left more than one. A few buildings on Mullerstrasse he even left 3 cards in. And next street here on our right, Amsterdamer Strasse, is where Otto and Elise lived. It's a bit bumpy on the cobbles, forgive me. Won't be the steadiest film, but here's Amsterdam Street. Now this street did pretty well through World War II. However, one building on the street was destroyed in bombing. Oh, it's very bumpy here. And that was Amsterdam Strasse number 10, the building in which Elise and Otto lived between 1934 and their arrests in 1942. Now, Elise was arrested in her apartment. Otto had been arrested already the day before. After they were taken into custody, another family eventually moved into the building, but it was destroyed in a bombing raid in 1945, the only building on the street to be destroyed by bombing in the Second World War. 96 people were killed, including the family then living in the Hampel's old apartment. But this red and white building here stands on the side of the Hampel's old flat, old building at Amsterdam Street number 10, and there's a little plaque there on the wall to them as well. So here's a closer look at that plaque upon the wall of the new building. It says, "Here stood the house in which Otto and Elise Hampel lived from 1934 until their arrest. The working class couple would be executed in Berlin Plutonsi on April 8, 1943. Their resistance against the inhumanity of the National Socialist regime would be the inspiration for Hans Fallada's novel, Every Man Dies Alone." I want to give you a bit more of an idea of the atmosphere in the inner courtyards in the buildings in Wedding, and these are the kind of places in the stairwells and courtyards where Otto would have been leaving his postcards. So I've just gotten lucky. I just wanted to film this building from the outside, but a resident passing by let me in. So now we're inside one of the buildings on Strasse, in which Otto did leave one of his cards actually on the 24th of March 1941. Now he might have dropped it here where I am in the foyer, or if this door were open, he would perhaps have put it here on the stairs. The sad thing is, of course, about these cards, the reason why we have so many details about them is that, well, the people living in the buildings would have almost universally taken them to the Gestapo. So you might say that the Hampels were denounced many times. But this is the building where one of the cards was left as it looks today, 138C on Mullerstrasse. But as I say, all along this street, so many of the 192 cards would have been dropped. Wow, I've gotten really lucky again. This is Mullerstrasse 151, and this is one of the buildings of which Otto was very fond, because he left 3 different cards here on 3 different dates here in the stairwell. So it's really been so exciting to be biking and walking around in this neighbourhood and wondering how Otto might have felt all the stress and tension leaving these cards in the stairwell. Such a small thing, but such an enormous risk. What if a door would open and he would have been seen? He was seen more than once, and descriptions of him were made to the Gestapo. Also, the cards were being handed into them more or less as fast as he was writing them, and so in the end the net was closing slowly on the pair, and in October 1942 they were brought into custody. After the first postcards were discovered in the Wedding neighbourhood, they were handed in to the Nazi secret police, or Gestapo. Criminal Secretary Willy Puschel was put in charge of the case. He was a junior detective, still in his 20s at the time. He collected the cards, but could not crack the case until the Hampels were eventually denounced and discovered. So now I'm really in the city centre. Here's the River Spree, and you can see Museum Island there in the middle of the water. Also the Berlin Cathedral stands upon the island too. But over here would have been 100 years ago Berlin's main Jewish quarter. And on the street Bergstrasse there's a mixture of old and new buildings, but the new building in the distance is standing where one of the offices of the Nazi secret police, or Gestapo, once stood. And it's in this building, or where this building stands, that Otto and Elise Hampel were brought after their denunciation and capture. Now, they were questioned here by Criminal Secretary Puschel. They both confessed freely to the crime. Otto said only he was responsible for writing the postcards. In fact, he said that Elise wouldn't have had the ability, the handwriting or vocabulary to write them even if she should have wanted to. Elise, for her part, said she was equally as responsible as Otto. They were remanded here, but they were still allowed at that stage to have some visitors, and Otto also was able to visit Elise on her 39th birthday. Otto, in his written confession, requests a mild punishment and says surely this would be sufficient to teach him a lifelong lesson. There is a plaque here pertaining to the Gestapo building, which I wanted to show to you as well. Now we're within the walls of the old Moabite Penitentiary complex. It's a 19th century panoptical star-shaped prison, and the Nazis used it to house many members of the resistance, including for the time Elise and Otto Hampel. They would have been incarcerated here in between making their confession at the Gestapo building on Strasse and their trial at the People's Court in January 1943. After that, also some of the men involved in the Valkyrie assassination attempt against Hitler in 1944 would be incarcerated here at Moabite. Now, the prison complex did survive the war, but it was pulled down in the 1950s, and just there in the distance is the central station, Hauptbahnhof. So now I'm at Potsdamer Platz, and you might recognize the Sony Centers there behind me. But where that building stands used to be a complex of courthouses, which the Nazis would take over in 1935 and use as one of the locations of their so-called People's Court for the next 10 years. Now, the People's Court throughout Germany, through the Nazi regime, would sentence at the least 5,243 people to death, including Elise and Otto Hampel. They stood trial here at Potsdamer Platz on January 22nd, 1943, accused of preparation for high treason and of subverting the German war effort. The judge was Dr. Günther Löhmann. After the 3-hour trial, sentenced them both to death, to the permanent loss of their civil liberties. That also meant they could be tortured in prison and that their corpses would not be restituted to their families, and they had to pay as well for the court proceedings. After this trial, Elise and Otto Hampel never met again. The courthouse itself was destroyed in a bomb blast in February 1945, which also killed its most notorious judge, Roland Freisler. Subsequent to the sentencing, Otto Hampel was sent directly to Plutonsi prison in western Berlin, not far from his former home in Wedding. Elise Hampel was remanded in the women's prison in the city centre, very near to Alexanderplatz. Both began immediately to make pleas for clemency, and their lawyers also attempted to intervene on their behalf. Their relatives and Otto's colleagues wrote to the Gestapo, and in this letter, Elise's parents even write directly to Adolf Hitler, sending him 300 Reichsmarks as a birthday gift and begging him to intervene to help their daughter. All pleas for clemency would have gone to the Gestapo headquarters at Prince Albrecht Strasse and been reviewed by Reich Minister of Justice Otto Thierack, who upheld the original sentence. So now I'm just a little bit north of Alexanderplatz, lots of communist-era architecture around me, and I've brought you over here to show you that here where it's all overgrown, this is the site of the former women's prison at Barnum Strasse, which stood here until its demolition in 1974. Now, Elise Hampel was held in this prison in between her trial and then her transfer to Plutonsi, where she was executed. And here it mentions that over 300 women like Elise Hampel would have been incarcerated here, who were later executed at that same prison, Plutonsi. Now behind this brick wall is the prison Plutonsi, which is still in use today, and this is where Otto Hampel was brought after the trial in the People's Court. If you remember, Elise Hampel was held at the women's prison at the other side of the city, and they never met again following the verdict. Now they were though both brought into the area of Plutonsi prison where executions were carried out. So Otto Hampel was transferred from one part of the prison to another, and Elise Hampel was transferred across the city. Now the area of the prison where the so-called death wing stood would have been here behind this grey gate. This is where the two were held in adjacent cells, albeit that, as I say, they had no contact with one another, and they were both executed here too, 2 minutes apart by guillotine, after which their corpses were given to the Anatomical Institute at the Berlin University. This aerial photograph shows you the part of Plutonsi prison in which condemned inmates were held immediately prior to their execution. This area of the complex was largely destroyed in aerial bombardments during World War II. The prisoners would have been taken from their cells and led to the execution chamber. In this photograph, you see the execution room at Plutonsi as it looked in 1943. At the back of the room are hooks for hangings, in front of which is the guillotine, on which Otto Hampel was executed at 7:28 p.m. and Elise Hampel at 7:30 p.m. on April 8, 1943. I'm going to read to you now an explicit eyewitness account of Plutonsi executions, so if you would rather not hear that, please mute or fast forward the video until the image changes. In the last half hour before the enforcement of the law, an old shoemaker undertook a task with zeal. He would visit the condemned in their death cell, bind their hands behind them, remove their clothes and shoes, and swap their shoes with the prescribed wooden clogs. The woman's hair he would cut short so that the neck would be free. He did it with equanimity, without emotion, and with a sort of dull satisfaction. Now and then the executioner and his assistants would visit the candidates for death in their cells. They looked in the mouths of the condemned for gold teeth, which they could later remove. The bound delinquent would be brought to the execution room with his upper body naked. After the reading of the sentence in the presence of the required witnesses, the prosecutor would address the executioner with the prescribed statement, "Executioner, perform your duty." Only now would the executioner, with a sharp tug, pull back the black curtain. Now the guillotine under electric light was visible. The condemned had to stand by a raised, grooved board. Before he could gather his wits, the assistants threw him against the board, which was hinged and tipped him at a 90-degree angle. The delinquent was then placed with lightning speed in a position in which his head was directly under the blade. It was the art of the assistants to estimate the height of the victim accurately. In the same second, the executioner pushed the button. The blade raced downwards, the head of the condemned flew into the waiting basket. The blood loss was monstrous. The legs of the dying twitched so that the wooden board would be shoved far away. So I would say now let's leave this awful place, and the last location I'd like to bring you to is the side of the building in which the Hampels were discovered, in which Otto Hampel left his final of the almost 200 postcards. Now this post-war building before me is the site of where Elise and Otto Hampel's efforts at resistance against the Nazis would come to an end. The building itself, Eisenacher Strasse 122, it did survive World War II, but it was pulled down after the war, and it was replaced then by this modern complex. In fact, that takes up a few different house numbers on the street, Eisenacher Strasse. But if I will show you now across the road, the surviving building still standing, you get a much better sense as to how number 122 would have been looking on September 27th, 1942, the day on which Otto Hampel left the final postcard here in the stairwell of number 122. Otto Hampel inside the building, outside as usual on the pavement, was Elise waiting for him. Otto dropped the final postcard, and this time he was seen to do so by a resident of the building, a woman then 65 years old called Gertrude Waschke. Now Gertrude Waschke, who saw Otto Hampel leave his 192nd postcard there in the stairwell at Eisenacher Strasse 122. She was 65 then, she was a widow. She worked in a factory making parts for wireless receivers. She saw the card. She was horrified by it. She took it around the corner. Not 5 minutes walk away was the police station at Nollendorfplatz, number 174. And there she arrived at 4:10 in the afternoon and gave her description of Otto Hampel and handed in the card. And as she spoke to the officer there on duty, who should walk past the window but Elise and Otto on their way to catch the tram back home to Wedding. The police came out, took their details and let them go. But as you know, less than a month after that, both would be arrested. Otto at work, Elise the next day at home. And the next time Gertrude Waschke saw the Hampels was in court. She would speak at their trial from 10:35 in the morning to 10:45. For that, she was allowed to claim for 2 hours of absence money from work, but on the form, she stamped out for 5 hours. So either the clerk that day admired her as a patriotic German or perhaps felt a bit sorry for her, might be more likely. She received, though, for her testimony 3 Reichsmarks, 10 pennies, and 35 pennies for the transport to and from the courthouse. Gertrude Waschke was in court once more. On the 10th of March of 1949, she stood trial, accused of crimes against humanity for her denunciation of the Hampels. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but she was in very poor health and her sentence was commuted to 2 years. It's been a long day learning this story. We've gone to almost all 4 corners of the city, biked many miles. The sun's going down. I wanted to finish the story, tell you one last thing about Gertrude Waschke to finish the tale of Elise and Otto Hampel. And it's this. In 1946, a man came to Gertrude Waschke's flat, whom she had never seen before, rang the doorbell and would visit her in her flat. She never saw the guy again either, stranger to her. Now this man, whoever he was, it was important to him to visit this woman and tell her about Elise and Otto Hampel, who they were, what had happened to them, the verdict, and the death sentence. Now, there's no reason to think that Gertrude Waschke would have known that the Hampels were declared guilty or indeed sentenced to death. She left the court that day, and unless she would have investigated it, she wouldn't have found it out. By that point, half the court cases in the People's Court ended in a capital sentence, and Otto and Elise, after all, were not that prominent as members of the resistance, so their story wouldn't have been in the press. Their sentence would not have been put up in placards around the city like it would have been for more prominent members of the resistance. So it's perfectly plausible the first time Gertrude Waschke learned about the execution of Elise and Otto was in 1946 in her apartment when the stranger came to visit her. And after he left, she had the first of 3 heart attacks she would suffer. But who was this man who would come all the way to visit her, someone she didn't know, someone who knew who she was, who knew the details of the case intimately, who knew who Gertrude Waschke was, where she lived, and someone to whom it was very important that the story be told, that people around the Hampels would learn what had happened to them, the consequences of the trial. But she didn't know who it was, so I don't know who it was. But it could be anyone, I suppose. It can only be one person. Almost indubitably, the man who came to see Gertrude Waschke in her flat in 1946, it was the author, Hans Fallada.